And if you're just joining us, I'd love to know where you're logging on from. If you're able to drop in the chat, we'd love to know where you're logging on from. And then we are gonna dive in. Wow, India, Omaha. Oh, cool. Great.
Yay, Philly. I grew up there. Wait, I saw Philly somewhere.
Awesome. St. Paul. What a cool group. Texas. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. Oh, and I'm gonna ask everyone to mute themselves. Or I'll mute you. I'm Sally. Welcome to Radio Bootcamp. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I'm so pleased to welcome Jerome Socolovsky. He is NPR's audio journalism trainer, and he's been a journalist for so long that one of his first big stories was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Um, that's in 1989. And he's worked at NPR and for different platforms and outlets. I have a list here, radio, print, TV, the Associated Press, Voice of America, Religion News Service, probably more that I'm missing. And we're so pleased that he is going to talk about his new book. So, Jerome, thank you so much. And I'm just going to begin with a question right off the bat. And by the way, folks in the peanut gallery, please pop any questions you have in the chat and we will do our best to get to them. Jerome, who did you write this book for?
Yeah. Hi, Sally, and just thanks for inviting me on to have a chance to talk about the book, which I have right here. Um, yeah, I had kind of three groups of uh, readers in mind when I wrote the book. The first is journalism students. That was like when I was approached, the publisher told me this is a book that a lot of J schools use, a lot of journalism professors um, assign as required reading for their students, and they were very eager to have an update. The last book, the last edition came out in 2008. So obviously, it was time for an update. Um, I also had, but I also wrote it for existing journalists, just either people who were interested in going into audio journalism, learning audio storytelling, or who are doing it already and just want some, to learn how other people do it, get some tips and tricks from kind of some of the best in the business, the people I interviewed. And then as I was writing it, I'm a journalist. I can't help but write for a wider public, and so I wrote it like the more or less the same way I used to write my stories for the AP, my print stories, or what we now call digital stories. And so I wrote it kind of also for people just interested in having a little peek behind the scenes at NPR.
Ooh, can you give us a peek behind the scenes? I'm gonna put a link to the book in the chat. And for those of you who just joined us, if you have questions, please pop them into the chat. What is in the book? Like, can you give us a preview of the list of chapters briefly? I know you can't
Yep.
tell us the whole book, but briefly,
Right.
what's in the book?
Well, so I organized the book kind of the way, like following the trajectory of a story or a story idea, um, going from sort of if there's a chapter on pitching, a chapter on producing, writing, editing, voicing slash delivery, and then kind of I work my way and end with shows, putting together shows and podcasts. So taking those stories and sort of curating them and presenting them. But actually, I need to back up because that's really chapters 2 through 15, I think it is. Chapter 1 is really kind of like who we are, what are NPR's values and our ethics and standards, because I felt like that really was like underlying everything I wrote. And so yeah. Did I miss any chapters? I have it here. Oh yeah, and like toward I also have a um I mean there were a couple chapters that were not in the previous edition, and for example, one is multi-platform reporting, and just even though this is a book about audio journalism, like it's rare that you really can just focus on the audio story. And often you have to do a digital version as well. You might do some short form videos for Instagram or TikTok, or need to appear on a longer form podcast. I mean, it was nice in the, I guess, back when I was a reporter, when you really, you had your story, you had the show you were doing it for, and that was the one thing you could focus on. So I also kind of give some tips on how to think about the different platforms, moving from one to the other, since I've worked in those different platforms, and also how to sort of plan your um, plan your reporting so that you already have those things in mind. Because one thing I heard over and over again is that, it shouldn't be an afterthought. Don't go out, do all your reporting, and then think, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a video version of this, or wouldn't it be nice to have a digital version?
Oh, and speaking of multi-platforms, there's a great question from Shrikant. Is there an audiobook version of the book? Will there be an audio version of the book?
I don't know of any plans to have one, but I can pass that along to say that there is interest.
Okay, and this is something I was curious about actually when you and I were chatting. So, full disclosure, I teach, in higher ed, and sometimes I run into students who are really struggling with the idea of being journalists or reporting stories. And I guess the question is this something you can teach? Like, can you teach curiosity, for example?
Yeah, I mean, though, I guess I don't know. I guess you'd have to ask the people I've tried to teach it to, or I've trained on it. I like to think about um, journalism reporting essentially as always falling back to the question of why. Why are you doing this? Why did you? I think someone needs to mute themselves. Um, so like well, let me back up as to whether you can teach it. I mean, it's not it's hard because you can be a really good journalist, and a lot of it is like you do it from the seat of your pants, you follow your gut or your instinct. And there's also the problem of, like, I like to think systematically about all the things I'm doing, and in the book, partly I try to do that. I try to break down, the different rules for writing, but then actually they're not rules. There are exceptions to those rules, and you need to know the rules in order to be able to break the rules, and have exceptions for when, you know or break the rule when breaking the rule actually helps tell the story better. um but yeah, but I think that one principle that I think comes through in a lot of the training, and I hope in the book too, especially like in the interviewing chapter, is that question of why. And it's a question um, that's sometimes hard to ask, because you almost have to like present yourself as a little ignorant, like, especially for early career journalists. When I was starting out, and some of the people I talked to, like Rebecca Hersher, a really accomplished science correspondent, she talks in that interviewing chapter about just, feeling like she has to impress the person that she's interviewing with her knowledge of the topic. And actually, she found that usually, if someone has uh, the I can't remember the exact quote, but she says, like, if someone already thinks that you are ignorant or you don't know the subject
Hi
matter.
Nash, how you doing?
um, Could someone mute themselves, please? Yeah. Uh, if someone has already thinks that about you, you're not going to change their mind in, trying to impress them with how much you know about the topic. And that actually asking the very basic questions, she sees it now as an act of power, which I thought was really remarkable. I have a whole section in the interviewing chapter about preparing for an interview. I don't know if that was going to be like a follow-up question, Sally, or
Yeah, I think
about it now. Or...
what I'm hearing is that it's okay to act stupid, right? Like some people are afraid of stupid. I am fully embrace that as a general assignment reporter. One question that I think is good that's helpful and may help people understand who the book is for, because it strikes me what you're talking about can be applied to any kind of journalism. It's not just audio journalism, right? The like how to approach an interview and present yourself in an interview. Someone is asking, pointing out that a lot of station reporters are former newspaper people, right? We've seen this big decline in the newspaper industry. Do you think the book will be helpful for people coming from other mediums? Will it help them can it work for people who are trying to learn about audio specifically?
Yeah, and for such people, I would really point you to the chapter on writing. I think it's called Writing for Audio, or because there it really talks about how writing for the ear, I called it, how that's so different from writing for digital, and it's really, um, it just it's a little counterintuitive, but to write for your own voice, the way you talk conversationally, is just a really hard thing to do because we've been taught to write, through writing term papers and college essays and newspaper, print/ digital articles. And really, when we talk, we talk in short sentences, subject, verb, object, not many clauses, dependent clauses, or introductory clauses. And when you look at that, when you write that way, and you look at your scripts on paper, it looks a little like a little too simplistic. So it's you know it, so there are kind of sort of rules or guidelines for how to write for radio. Also, there are tips like Alyssa Nadworny, for example. She will first uh, talk to someone about her story. She will try to tell someone about her story. Often that person is just imaginary because she's out reporting, doing her thing. But she'll take her iPhone or her smartphone and just do a voice memo, like record a voice memo of her telling some imaginary person, her mother or friend or someone, the story, and then she'll transcribe that voice memo and then use that as the basis for her story. So I loved that as a tip. Um, and then also in the multi-platform reporting story, multi-platform reporting chapter, I have some kind of I offer like a cheat sheet of how to go from, even though I said before, like plan it all ahead of time if you're going to do both a radio and a digital version. Know that beforehand. Can someone mute themselves, please? If you're, um, but when like once you've done that and you've like written your audio story, there's like a cheat sheet for how to go from the audio story to the digital, and it talks about like the different how you the certain quotes that work for audio that don't for digital, and vice versa. So I hope that answers that question.
I think so. I feel seen because I use the phone tip, the voice memo tip.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And I think something else that might be helpful is there are books about podcasting out there. Can you talk a little bit about what makes NPR's style of audio journalism different, sort of the way of thinking about an NPR story and what that is and how you address that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I was very mindful of there being other books about podcasting because, in fact, when I was pitching the new edition of this book, NPR had just published a book about podcasting, which I have somewhere in my office, but I would hold it up if I could find it. But anyway, so and there's some overlap. There's some things in my book that are in that book too. That it was written by Glenn Weldon from our culture desk, and he's a really good journalist. Um, but that often podcast books are about like how to start a podcast or ideas for format and um, and obviously sometimes marketing and other aspects. Whereas this is really a book about journalism, just audio journalism. When if you're covering news and you're presenting it in a way that's meant to be heard, and that's it sounds very kind of simple, or you might say, well, Jerome, what's the difference? What's the big deal here? And it's like, um, there is this power with audio journalism where it's so intimate, and I really I was I mean a lot of writing this book was like relearning this whole thing myself and talking to someone like Ada Peralta, who was he told me the story about an interview he did with the leader of a rebellion in Sudan. Maybe it was South Sudan. I don't remember. But the guy was sort of on the run, and he met the guy like in the back seat of his car in a parking lot, and they parked the car sort of back, front faced out in case the guy had to make a break for it. And he's in there with his microphone right up to the guy's mouth, and he has a few minutes with him, asks him a few questions, and it feels like a very kind of thing that just passed by really quickly. But later, when he heard the interview, he just realized that having the microphone right there up to his mouth made it sound so powerful, and so intimate. And it's really this thing where we have the our own voices and the people we're interviewing. People are hearing them often like with earbuds or headphones. It's like someone is talking to you right up here. And I don't let anyone get that close to me in my life, except, maybe my wife or kids or a dog or something. We're very kind of, it's a very intimate thing. And then there's just the personality that shines through, that comes through when you hear an actuality uh, from someone, as opposed to like reading a quote in, reading words on a page. You really you hear their timbre, the emotional quality of their voice, um, and then there's that immersive feeling of when you can go out and get ambient sound and include that in your piece. You really are taking people to the scene. Like NPR once had this campaign, I mentioned it in the book, called NPR Takes You There. And it really comes from that thing that radio or audio, now we should call it audio, does so well, because podcasts can do it too.
So speaking of podcast, radio to podcast, what has changed since the last edition of the book, or the it's not the is it the original, but the last edition.
Yeah, it's um
This I have this
there was
this old.
yeah, that's the yeah, I have both of them here actually. There was one before called Sound Reporting, but it was a very, very different kind of book and format. Um, so this one, the old one, is you can see it's really kind of worn out. I really used it a lot in my own career. And this was published in 2008. And there were I guess one of the big things, sadly, that's changed is, okay, let me back up. First of all, like podcasting was in its infancy when this book came out. So I think Jonathan like added a chapter, the author added a chapter toward the end talking about podcasting. But I think we had, a politics podcast, and maybe, I don't remember if Planet Money had started uh, in that year or not. where and so we had fewer shows. NPR was a much smaller organization. I think there were like 10 or maybe less than a dozen shows, and now it's like up to 30. Um, and so that's one thing that NPR has just become a much bigger organization doing many more things. That's why I addressed kind of multi-platform reporting. Then also, sadly, I have to say that this book, you know, the word safety doesn't appear in this book. This is the previous edition in uh, in relation to journalists, which obviously there were safety issues for journalists back then, but it's just gotten so much worse. And sadly, two NPR journalists were killed, in the line of duty in Afghanistan. I dedicated the book to them, and I have a whole chapter about safety with tips from some of our journalists, or how our journalists deal with scary situations, covering civil unrest, war, but also online safety, cyber hygiene, that kind of thing. I talked to our security director, Caroline Dries, about that. So I guess I suppose those are the two big things that have changed. It's also, the news cycle has gotten that much faster. And there is a lot that is still the same. A lot of the principles of audio storytelling are really timeless and will be the same 20 years from now. I'm pretty sure of that. But the people who were quoted in this book, a lot of them no longer work at NPR. So I had a whole new well, there were a couple exceptions. There were some people who were in both books. Um, but um, yeah, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, there are people in both books. Some of the principles are timeless, but talking to a whole new group of people about the same topics uh, was, led me in different directions. So, for example, there's a section in the interviewing chapter about kind of this idea of what I was mentioning before, that, as an early career journalist, I remember having this, I was afraid to push back when somebody would tell me something that didn't make sense or was incomplete. But I just, you assume that, well, this person is very practiced at, they're super media savvy. I'm sure if they said it, people will understand it. And actually, that's not the case. You really do need to push back. But in the next section, actually the previous section, uh, I talk about, the need to focus in when you're doing the interview and really listen and sort of kind of shut out all the distractions that we have in our lives now. Not be looking at your phone or even your list of questions, and really be focused on the person that you're talking to. I have a really nice kind of quote from Brian Mann on how he really like sort of brings his like his heart rate down and his body temperature down, and really tries to just be like super present with that person at that moment.
When you and I chatted previously, you mentioned something really funny about what you thought an audio journalist, like how they should do an interview. Can you talk briefly about that? You would just kind
Um,
of, you would
like,
show up in people's offices.
yeah, I mean, when I started out, so kind of one of the tips in the book is to just to get people to do something, get them out of their office, because you know, in their office they feel like, I don't know, maybe it's their comfort zone. You want them to feel comfortable, I suppose, but you also want them to be doing something, to be active. I mean, this morning, Layla Fadel did this really nice long piece just going with an activist in Syria who's looking for, missing people. and that whole segment, it's like 10 minutes long. It's all full of action. They're going different places. And I was thinking this morning, like, imagine if she had just met this activist in, like, he was a Syrian American activist. So I imagine he doesn't have an office there, but they could have just met in his hotel and sat down and done an interview. And yeah, sure enough, when I started out, I would show up in someone's office, like put my and Lauren Freyer in the book also talks about this. Like, she would just put her microphone on a stand and sit back and like interview the person, and they would talk, and it would be like the most boring interview ever. And so what she learned to do, and it's also something I would do, is if people really want to talk in their office, you let them, you do that interview, and then you say, hey, why don't you show me around your factory or your farm or wherever you are, or let's go for a walk somewhere. Um, and um, and this is a really, what I talked about, timeless principles before. This is so timeless that when I talked to Susan Stamberg, that was one of her tips. And I actually have a bit of audio. Can I play it, Sally? Where
Please, please.
yeah, she goes to interview Helen Hayes, who was an actress, and she was, I think, 80 or 80 something at the time. And she read in her in Hayes's biography that she had this that she loved M&Ms. So she took on her way to interview her, she bought a bag of M&Ms and handed it to her. And so let me find that clip. I'll play. This is how the her piece begins.
Helen Hayes does not disappoint. Almost 90 now, her eyes are as twinkling in person as they are on screen. Her skin is a soft nest of wrinkles. She's thrilled with a small gift, prompted by a chocolate habit she reveals in her book. Oh, M&Ms, I adore them. Oh, bless your heart, aren't you sweet? M&Ms, my blessed name. Well, you know when I like to eat these? At night, sitting up in bed reading. Miss Hayes lives in a big white Victorian house in Nyack, New York, 27 miles north of Broadway.
Okay, so yeah, so there are. I also want to mention that the book. Um, Whenever I had stories like that I referenced, there are footnotes, and there's a page on the NPR website which has links to all these stories. So as you're reading, you can also listen to the stories, and that page is NPR. Maybe I'll just write it in the chat. It's npr.org at, or not at, slash sound reporting.
We should all bring M&Ms to all our interviews. Is that the takeaway? Find out your source's favorite kind of chocolate and bring that.
Yeah, or just find some way to get them, you know, to get some kind of action or even interaction in your interviews. I actually do an interviewing training. I don't remember if I have this in the book or not, but where at NPR, where I really, because a lot of people coming from digital backgrounds, they know how to interview, uh, and what I talk about is how, like, the disruptions or the moments where unexpected things happen in interviews is often what really makes the story for you, what really brings it alive. I actually have another piece of tape, if I can play it, in which that happened. I was covering there was a migrant crisis in Spain, you know, back in the 2008 or 9, I think, and there were like these boats full of African migrants arriving in the Canary Islands. So I went down there, and I'll play just how that piece started. I was talking to someone who was sort of organizing um, the the like first aid and reception for the immigrants.
Jerome Socolovsky went to the Canary Islands and spoke with the emergency response coordinator of the Red Cross.
When they make this journey, they really don't seem to realize what they're embarking on. Bear in mind, the majority of them can't swim. The boats have absolutely no safety measures.
Austin Wainwright stands on the dock of the Los Cristianos ferry port on the island of Tenerife. He's discussing the surge of migrants when his cell phone rings.
Sí. Dime.
Wainwright has just heard that a migrant boat has been located and will be towed into port in just 30 minutes.
30 minutos.
The Red Cross coordinator alerts the harbor policeman across the wharf. Then he and his volunteers scramble to set up pneumatic tents for a field hospital and bring in food and clothing. 30 minutes later, a Spanish maritime rescue cutter tows in a wooden boat that is longer than the cutter itself.
So yeah, I mean, I obviously I didn't plan for that to happen, but when it happened, I kind of went with it. I didn't say like, "Oh, that's a shame. We're gonna have to do this interview all over again."
What
So,
so that was a surprise that happened during your interview, which was great. What surprised you about writing the book? What surprises did you encounter?
I guess, well, one thing I don't know if it surprised me. I guess what really impressed me was just how I already knew that like people who are in public radio and in a lot of podcasting, they're really very passionate about what they do. What really surprised me is how much people just love talking about the craft. And you know, I was telling you, Sally, a couple of days ago that like, you know, I'm used to, as a journalist, I was always used to people not calling me back when I asked for interviews. And, you know, especially when I was reporting in Spain, they were, you know, people were like, you know, US public radio, like, why should we talk to you? My wife at the time was a correspondent for Swedish public radio, and in Spain there was a socialist government, so like the government officials would always call her back and would never call me back because they wanted to kind of brag that they were on the radio in Sweden. So, but like, you know, in reporting and asking for interviews from this book, I can't think of I did more than 80 interviews with people, and I can't remember anyone who said no, you know, that they didn't want to be interviewed. Everyone's really busy, and they made time, really carved time out of their busy schedules to talk to me. Another thing I guess that really kind of surprised me, and I don't know, maybe I should have known this before, but I never really thought about it. It's just like how, and this isn't just audio, I guess, but like, that you really, it's almost like being a journalist requires you to be superhuman, in a way that you really have to, like, if you're a host, you know, you're in this fishbowl, you're in this kind of glass bubble, and yet you're talking about things happening all over the world, and you have to be, you know, sound knowledgeable about, you know, events happening thousands of miles away, and strike the right tone, say the right thing, know the right answer. Also, if you know when you're when you're interviewing, like I spoke before, and you're in that space, and you want to be, I mean, in the book I talk about how it's really like being like you want to sort of strive to be the way you might be on a first date, where you're really like into this person and you're just hanging on every word, and you're just so you're interested, and you're not just pretending to be interested, you really are interested, because if you just pretend, it's um people can see through it. And so you're like just 110% focused on this person, but at the same time you're also playing, you know, these different kind of production scenarios with them, like, okay, should I ask them to go up on the roof and we talk a little bit more there, because there we can kind of look around the neighborhood and get a better idea of the devastation, or, you know, should I be doing this or that? You're thinking about your next questions, and so it's yeah, it's just like you really have to be on, you know, 110%. 10 or 20%.
I think there are a lot of people out there now who think that they're doing this successfully, just like based on the number of podcasts I see out there and like social media and like, you know, people saying like we're gonna get a bottle of wine and just like have a great conversation because we're really good at that. Um, can you talk a little bit, I guess, about what it is that if you were trying to persuade one of those people who's like, yeah, I have a bottle of wine with my girlfriend and like we have a great podcast and we're mystified because we only have 6 listeners. Um, can you talk a little bit about the skills or ways of thinking that you outline in the book that might be helpful for people like that?
Um, hmm. You
Is that
know,
too broad? I
yeah,
don't want to stump you.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe it's a little broad. I mean, obviously because I do think that like
It's
often
about sound recording or
your
something.
own
Okay.
Can I do that for you?
with someone Laura Almo, your can you mute yourself, please?
I'm going to chase down all the unmuters and mute them.
Thanks. I mean, I think I guess part of the challenge is to really kind of get out of your own bubble, and really think about like, and this is sort of to the point of curiosity that we started talking about earlier. You really need to know like what is it that most people in whatever your audience is, don't know about this. What would they find really interesting? How can I present this in a way that, you know, you have to get, sorry, I'm hitting the microphone here. You have to, because I talk with like wave a lot when I talk. You have to get them really interested in the topic, but at the same time, you want to challenge them a little bit, or you want to tell them something they don't already know, surprise them a little bit. And so, yeah, I'm trying to think of like where exactly in the book I address that. And I admit, I finished writing this book in October of 23, because that's just the sort of the long march that it takes to publish a book. So um, I'd have to look to see where in the book I talk about, probably actually in the pitching chapter. I think that's where where I talk about this, like following your curiosity and also being open-minded about things. There's a scene in the book where John Burnett is sort of like hurrying across the what's it called, the Zocalo, the square, that main square in Mexico City, on his way to an interview with, I think it was a labor leader or someone, and he like hears this interesting this noise, and it was this guy down the street like making music through with a blade of grass, and he just kind of like followed his curiosity and started talking to him, and even like canceled or like on the go rescheduled his the interview he appointment he had in order to go and talk to this guy who was like, he said if this guy had grown up, um in the US or somewhere else and had or some anywhere else and had more means, he might have been a concert pianist. But instead he was a busker on the street making music with a blade of grass. So it's that kind of open-mindedness and like willingness to sort of follow your gut and your curiosity, about things. And then I think also, um, one thing that's important, I think, like in this day and age, a lot of people follow their own, following their own interests sometimes comes with a certain way of seeing things or certain kind of preconceptions. And I talked to Daniel Estrin about this because obviously he's covering a really complicated story, and people have, very strong opinions on, so many different sides. And he talks about this idea of like, yeah, often I have I go into a story with my own ideas or my own opinions about it, and but then I always try to challenge myself. Like he will find someone who kind of expresses that opinion that he might agree with, but then he really always makes a point of finding someone who challenges that and gets the other side of the story or another side of the story or the different sides of the story, and then always ends up like learning something and with a much more sophisticated appreciation of whatever the topic is.
And speaking of sides of stories and challenges, I looked in the old book at the table of contents, and I think it was worth pointing out that in the old table of contents, the first chapter is sound and stories, but your first chapter is what we stand for. And I guess what I'm getting at is kind of the elephant in the room or the elephant in the landscape that trust in institutions and journalism is eroding. How do you address that in the book? Do you address that in the book? And if so, how?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons. Can you all hear me and see me? Because Sally, you're frozen for me, but
I can hear you.
oh, good. Okay. Um, I mean, it's one of the reasons that I made that chapter on values, chapter one, because I thought it was just so important to sort of that it just underlies everything we do. And for that chapter, I guess one of the key interviews there was with our managing editor for Standards and Practices, Tony Cavan, and he was a former CBS News editor and also Standards editor, and he talked about like coming to NPR and really being impressed with the respect that we have for both both for our listeners and for people we interview, but especially for the audience. And he also made the point that NPR back in I don't know 10, 20 years ago had this like natural advantage because and it was one that was based on technology because we had the technology to sound our very good. We had this crystal clear FM signal that other people didn't have access to. um, People were impressed by that, and they believed us. Whereas now, and anybody can, with a laptop and a you know a cheap microphone, can sound as good as NPR does. And so, what really distinguishes us, or what we should realize, is that what really distinguishes us is our credibility. And always, we have a page where we're public about our any correction we make, and we've just kind of bolstered our editorial review team, so we're really kind of um, doubling down on fact checking and just making sure that we tell complete stories, fair stories. And yeah, as you said, Sally, that there was a chapter. It was chapter 2 in the old book called Fairness, and it talked about our ethics to a certain extent. But I really made that chapter 1 and discussed, a range of the trustworthiness, different sections on, impartiality, transparency, accuracy, diversity. And then one last thing was just this idea of empathy, which I really kind of connect that to the public radio style of, telling news for the ear. That really, we present news to be listened to as like that. When people hear other people on the news, they really connect with them in a way that um, words on a page don't. And I have a nice quote, actually. Let me see if I can find it quickly and read it for you from because I think this says a lot about the book. You know, a lot of media organizations are working on diversity. Many also value the same things we do, such as credibility and impartiality. So what distinguishes NPR from other media? It's a question I asked myself when I set out to write this book and that I put to the journalists I interviewed. As I mentioned earlier, Tony was impressed by the level of respect we have for the listener. I found something that goes beyond respect in interview after interview, and that's empathy. In later chapters, you'll read about how in covering mental health, Ritu Chatterjee sometimes drops a reporting idea because the person is more important than the story. How Adrian Florido chooses to spend time with people in crisis before he interviews them. I get emotional with them, and that creates a bond, he says. And how hosts such as Rachel Martin show empathy with guests who are distraught. Just imagine how you would want to be treated if you were in a similar situation. So yeah, I thought about that quite a bit. And I don't know if you wanted to go to questions.
Yeah, I just put a note in the chat for anyone who has questions, please, for Jerome, please pop them in the chat. Here is one from earlier. It says, this is from Jacob, what they loved about the previous edition is that it taught people about the various jobs in the world of audio journalism and how they all work together at NPR, which is sort of like a great geeky question that I can get behind too. Does your version of the book do that also? Do you go through the jobs and how people work together to produce shows and podcasts at NPR?
Yeah, Jacob, thanks for the question. And yes, very much so. And that was one of the things that I really appreciated from the last book too, because I was working thousands of miles away from the mothership. And it was just really helpful to have a book that described, you know, what show editors do and executive producers and all the different people I was, you know, connecting with back in Washington or Culver City. And so yeah, I mean, each chapter the chapters are sort of, like I said earlier, follow the trajectory of a story, but also focus on different roles. So the producing chapter really focuses on what field producers do and the different kinds of producers we have at NPR. You know, show producers, line producers, podcast producers, you know, I get into sort of those different roles. The editing chapter, you'll have their line editors as well, and show editors and desk editors. And I kind of break down their roles and what they focus on. So yeah, there's a ton of that in there, and it's kind of throughout the book.
Okay, here's another one. This is a favorite of mine. What is the biggest mistake you see new audio journalists make? And I know you already talked about your, you know, early strategy of just showing up and setting up your mic on a stand. And I will disclose that my biggest mistake was a one-time mistake of leaving Radiolab's shotgun microphone in the back of a taxi cab, and it took me 3 days to track it down. So don't do that. But is there a mistake you see people who are new to audio journalism make?
Well, I'm glad because the question was if there's the mistakes I see new audio journalists make, where Sally, you gave a mistake that you make, and if I was asked to talk about the mistakes I've made in my career, there would be so many. And they're now like coming back to me. So okay, I'll give one. Like I once went to we were talking about preparing for an interview before, and I had this I went to a vigil or a speech that like the mayor of when I was in Holland, the mayor of Amsterdam was giving, but I tend to arrive. I'm the kind of person who arrives late, and I've gotten better, although my wife says I not completely. But I arrived late and I missed his part of the ceremony, so I didn't hear what he said. And I went up to him afterward and like, you know, just kind of pigeonholed him or just got him and right afterward and asked him questions. And he was like, were you at the ceremony? Did you hear my speech? And I was like, no, I'm so sorry. And then he just like walked off. So that's when I learned to like just always arrive on time, even early, um, for any event. Now the question about what, the I wouldn't say a mistake that journalists who are new to audio make, because it's not really a mistake. I just feel that um, many people have so many when you're a reporter and you've done all your reporting, you put so much work into it and you want to tell your audience, you want to give all that information to your audience because you think it's important and it'll be useful to them. It'll help them understand whatever it is you're reporting on. And that's great in a digital format because the more and I have this in that multi-platform chapter, the more you have, the more information, the more details, the more quotes, the more stuff you have in your story, providing you write it well and you organize, the more authoritative you come across, the more credible your story is. Whereas in audio, it doesn't work that way. Like the more you try to put in your story, the more you risk confusing your listener because you make it harder for the listener uh, to just digest all that information, to absorb all that information. And remember, most people, uh, especially nowadays, are multitasking. They're doing something else while listening to your story. They're jogging or they're driving or they're cooking or they're ironing or whatever. So you really have to pick like almost like the minimum amount of stuff, and you have to like keep trying to take things out of your story uh in order to make like with this less is more idea, take things out of your story so that the story gets better. So fewer quotes, fewer people in the story, fewer details, fewer numbers. um yeah, so I guess that's one of the big things I see people new to audio having to learn.
Spoken like an editor. And a perfect segue to this question from Alan Yu. The questions are now coming in very quickly. Um, Cutting room floors. There's something that didn't go into the book that you think could have, something you wish you could have included that got cut.
Oh, wow. I mean, I have something in the book that I admit got cut because I wanted to, in the editing chapter, I wanted to show that like editors, should cut stuff that, we reporters might think are really exciting. And I had this one um, stand up from it was a slaughterhouse, a pig slaughterhouse in Spain, where I did this stand up, and the stand up was just like much too gory, and my editor was like, Jerome, you're doing a story about Iberian ham. It's a delicacy. Nobody wants to hear about the blood and the guts so
Yeah.
yeah, that's what that's what editors are for, to sort of pull you out of that um, kind of intense focus you have, or the loss of perspective. But as far as like the book itself, and is there something I wish had been in there? That's a good question. I mean, um, I feel like the book, still stands on its own, even though earlier I said I finished writing it uh, about a year ago. I know a lot has happened, and there have been a lot of news developments. Um, but I tried to write it in a way so that, even though there are stories from the time of the pandemic or the early in the Ukraine war, they still kind of point to like things that are, um, just practices that are still relevant, or things that you should always keep in mind when you're out reporting. Lauren Magaki, a producer, she was uh, covering it wasn't even the Ukraine war. I think it was like the what Ukrainians see as the early part of their war, which is like the Russian, uh, take over the eastern regions in 2014, and she almost lost. Like they got stopped by what turned out to be Russian or irregular soldiers, and she almost had her like all her stuff taken away, and that's in the safety chapter. And it just like the way she realized, like now the way she approached that, she would have been a lot more like, yes, take everything I have, you know, no story is worth putting yourself in danger. So I think those things are still very, very relevant today, even
Okay,
though that happened 10 years ago. Yeah.
we have about 3.5 minutes left, which is perfect because we have 3 questions. Okay,
Okay.
so
One minute.
I'll just lay them lay them on you. Is there a teacher's guide?
Ooh, I don't, I didn't write one.
Okay.
This is my first book, first academic book, so I don't know how that works. Maybe I know the University of Chicago has a program for professors, so they might have something along those lines.
Great. Okay, next 2 questions. I will lay them on you. This is from Rebecca Robinson. You've talked about how timeless audio storytelling can be. How would you like to see it evolve, new techniques and technology in another 10 to 20 years? And then the other question is, can you give an example of how breaking the rules helped to tell a story better?
Okay, let me answer those in order. I think, and I have 2 minutes left. I mean, I think the challenge now is that, people used to, read, if they wanted to read news, they would go to a newspaper. If they wanted to see news, they'd turn on the TV. If they wanted to hear it, they would turn on the radio. Now people just pick up their phones and they're not like, you know, the sort of the lines between the platforms are disappearing. And I'd like to see the things that make audio storytelling special, that empathy, that what I talked about before, the intimacy, the personality, the immersiveness. I would love to see that, us keep that even as we start blurring the lines and doing working on different platforms. The second question was, remind me, Sally.
Scrolling. Oh, give examples of how breaking the rules helped to tell a story better.
Okay, I don't have time to look it up, but like uh in the writing chapter, and Stevinsky pointed, I talked to him about the rules, and he's the one who says, like, we shouldn't call them rules, we should call them guidelines, because you should always, you know you should break them when it helps tell the story better, or when it makes it more memorable. And I have a line from reporter Frank Morris, one of our national reporters, and he has this great line. It was about the football player. His name is escaping me. It was a Super Bowl victory parade, and he has this really wonderful descriptive line that like breaks almost all the rules of writing for the ear, and it's beautifully done, and it's so powerful, and it's great. So yeah, that's in the writing chapter. Frank Morris was
Great.
the reporter.
Um, all right. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Jerome, thank you so much for this talk. I learned a lot. I put an overly lengthy link to the new book in the chat. And I just actually learned this is, Jerome wrote this, but this is sort of like NPR's book, your book, NPR's book. You're the author, but this is NPR's book. Is that how it works? I don't know. Just sharing that.
Yeah, I don't make money off sales of this book. NPR does, though, so if you can also support NPR by buying the book.
So thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jerome. And
Everyone.
I hope we'll see you soon. Bye.
Great. Thank you, Sally.